some cache of ancient texts or artifacts that contained preserved knowledge? Do the Rosicrucians and Freemasons preserve fragmented wisdom passed down through genuine continuity, or did they reconstruct lost traditions through research and imagination? The symbolic systems these organizations use incorporate geometry, astronomy, and architectural principles that echo ancient knowledge. Whether that represents actual transmission or deliberate revival may be less important than recognizing the pattern to the human instinct to preserve and protect knowledge, considered sacred or dangerous. They hid the wisdom in temples and tombs. They encrypted it in symbols and rituals. They swore blood oaths to guard secrets that could remake the world or end it. And some of those secrets survived the burning libraries, survived the fall of empires, survived the catastrophes that erased civilizations. Not complete, not perfect, but enough fragments to whisper of what was lost and what might still be recovered if we learn to listen. Every culture remembers the water rising. Not some cultures, not most cultures. Every culture that has preserved oral traditions or written records going back far enough contains an account of catastrophic flooding that destroyed the world and forced humanity to begin again. The consistency is remarkable. The details vary, the names change, the theological frameworks differ, but the core narrative remains essentially identical across civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, cultures that never met, never traded, never shared stories around common fires. The biblical account of Noah is perhaps the most famous in Western consciousness. Divine judgment on a corrupt world, one righteous family chosen for survival, a massive boat built to specific dimensions, animals preserved in pairs, 40 days and nights of rain, waters covering the mountains, eventual landing on Ararat, a rainbow covenant promising never again. The story is so familiar, it's easy to forget how extraordinary its claims are. Worldwide inundation, total destruction of previous civilization, survival through maritime refuge, the world reborn from a handful of survivors. But Noah's flood isn't unique. It's one version of a story told everywhere. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia centuries before the biblical text, describes Utnapishtim surviving a God-sent deluge by building a boat according to divine instructions, preserving his family and representatives of all living things, weathering the storm, and eventually finding land on a mountain where he made offerings to the gods. The parallels to Noah aren't superficial. They're structural, suggesting either one tradition borrowing from the other, or both preserving memory of the same event through different cultural lenses. Hindu tradition tells of Matsya Avatar, where the god Vishnu manifests as a fish to warn Manu of coming catastrophe. Manu builds a boat, preserves the 7 sages and seeds of all plants, survives the deluge that destroys the world, and becomes the progenitor of humanity's next age. In China, Yu the Great channeled floodwaters and restored order after deluge threatened to destroy civilization entirely. The details differ from Middle Eastern accounts, but the fundamental pattern persists: catastrophic flooding, heroic survival, civilization rebuilt from ruins. Native American traditions across both continents preserve flood accounts. The Ojibwe tell of Nanabojo, surviving the Great Flood on a raft with animals, sending down various creatures to find Earth, eventually rebuilding the world from mud, brought up from beneath the waters. The Hopi describe multiple worlds destroyed by water before the current era, each destruction followed by emergence into a new world. Aztec legend speaks of the water-sun age ending in catastrophic flood. The Maya Popol Vuh describes gods destroying earlier human creations with deluge, before successfully creating the current humanity. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime preserves stories of massive flooding that separated Tasmania from the mainland. A memory that, if accurate, would have to date back over 10,000 years, to when sea levels were low enough for Tasmania to be connected. Pacific Islander legends across thousands of miles of ocean tell of islands sinking, populations fleeing to higher ground, entire land masses vanishing beneath waves. Greek mythology describes Deucalion's flood, where Zeus destroys humanity with water, and only a righteous couple survives to repopulate the earth. Norse tradition includes in Ragnarok the image of world-drowning waters, the end of the current age beneath rising seas. The consistent elements across these geographically and culturally isolated traditions are striking. Divine warning of coming catastrophe, righteous individuals or families chosen for survival, boats or rafts built to preserve life, waters rising to cover the world, landing on mountains or high ground, seeds, animals, or knowledge deliberately preserved, the world eventually drying, allowing humanity to begin again. These aren't vague similarities that require creative interpretation. These are specific, detailed parallels in narratives that supposedly developed independently. The standard explanation suggests that flood myths are natural because humans settled near water and experienced local flooding. River valleys flood, coastlines erode, tsunamis strike. Communities near water would naturally develop stories about catastrophic inundation. Perhaps. But does that explain the global consistency? Does it account for the specific details about worldwide destruction rather than local disaster? Does it address the fact that these aren't described as regional events, but as complete resets of human civilization? Either hundreds of isolated cultures independently invented remarkably similar fictional catastrophes, or they're all preserving memory distorted, mythologized, interpreted through different theological frameworks of the same real event. The myths don't just remember the flood. They remember what came before. They preserve descriptions of the civilizations that existed in the world that drowned, the societies whose achievements were so great that their destruction required divine intervention. And those descriptions are worth examining carefully because they might contain actual historical memory wrapped in layers of mythology and time. Plato's account of Atlantis appears in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, presented not as philosophical allegory, but as historical record received from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, claiming to preserve knowledge far older than Greek civilization. The priests placed Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon's time, approximately 11,500 years ago, coinciding almost exactly with the Younger Dryas period and the proposed cataclysm we've been examining. Plato describes a sophisticated island civilization with concentric rings of land and water, elaborate temples incorporating multiple metals, advanced architecture and infrastructure, powerful military forces that conquered much of Europe and North Africa, and technology involving alloys and engineering principles beyond what contemporary Greece possessed. Scholars have debated for millennia whether Plato invented Atlantis as philosophical metaphor or recorded genuine tradition. But the specific details he provides, the date, the location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the sudden destruction by earthquake and flood in a single day and night, these read less like philosophical invention and more like preserved account, however distorted by time and transmission. Other traditions describe similar lost civilizations. Lemuria or Mu appears in Pacific and Asian accounts as a vast continent in the Indian or Pacific Ocean, home to advanced civilization before catastrophic sinking left only scattered islands. The Hyperboreans of Greek tradition lived in the far north in a land of eternal spring, possessing wisdom and capabilities that later Greeks could only wonder at, until some catastrophe ended their golden age. Jewish and early Christian apocryphal texts describe antediluvian civilizations of remarkable sophistication, pre-flood humanity achieving technological advancement that wouldn't be matched again for millennia. The consistent theme across these accounts is advancement followed by corruption, material progress divorced from ethical development. Civilizations that achieved great things but lost their way fell into hubris, abused their knowledge, and invited either divine judgment or natural catastrophe as consequence. The biblical account emphasizes moral corruption. The earth was filled with violence. Greek versions stress human wickedness and pride. Hindu texts describe declining virtue through successive ages until the current era requires destruction and renewal. The Book of Enoch and related Jewish apocryphal texts describe the Watchers, angels or beings from elsewhere, who descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge, metallurgy and weapon-making, cosmetics and enchantments, astronomy and divination. The mixing of these teachings with humanity resulted in hybrid offspring, corrupted civilization, and eventual divine decision to cleanse the world through flood. Modern readers naturally interpret this through theological frameworks. But what if the core memory is more literal than we assume? What if the Watchers were survivors from more advanced pre-flood populations teaching less developed groups, their superior knowledge making them seem godlike, their intermarriage creating hybrid cultures that combined advanced technique with primitive contexts. The myths preserve descriptions of pre-flood technology that seem fantastic until you consider they might be distorted memories of real capabilities. Hindu epics describe Vimanas flying machines of various types, with specific technical details about their construction and operation. Various traditions mention weapons of terrifying destructive power, descriptions that some researchers find uncomfortably similar to nuclear or directed energy weapons. Later esoteric traditions attribute to Atlantis crystal-based power systems and technologies we can barely imagine. Separating historical memory from mythological embellishment becomes nearly impossible after millennia of oral transmission and cultural reinterpretation. But the pattern persists across too many isolated traditions to dismiss entirely. Advanced civilizations, great achievements, corruption or misuse of knowledge, catastrophic destruction. Survival of the righteous or fortunate, knowledge preserved in fragments by those who endured. The gods were too powerful. The angels taught forbidden secrets. The civilizations grew so advanced that heaven itself struck them down. Or so the stories claim. But what if the stories, beneath their theological frameworks and symbolic language, preserve genuine memory? What if the reason every culture remembers advanced pre-flood civilizations is because such civilizations actually existed, achieved remarkable things, made terrible mistakes, and paid the ultimate price? The myths might be our ancestors' way of ensuring we remember not just that it happened, but why. The flood myths don't just preserve memory of what happened, they preserve warnings about why it happened. And those warnings feel disturbingly relevant when you examine them carefully, as if the ancients were trying to tell their descendants something crucial about the relationship between knowledge, power, and survival. Divine judgment appears as a consistent theme across cultural variations. The catastrophe wasn't random. It wasn't arbitrary cosmic bad luck. It came as response to human behavior, to choices made, to lines crossed. The biblical account emphasizes that the earth was filled with violence, moral corruption, reaching levels that made destruction inevitable. Greek versions describe humanity's increasing wickedness and pride offending the gods. Hindu traditions track declining virtue through successive ages, each one worse than the last, until the accumulated corruption requires catastrophic reset and renewal. The religious frameworks vary, but beneath them lies a pattern that might preserve more than theological speculation. What if these accounts remember civilizations that did misuse their capabilities, that did pursue destructive technologies without considering consequences, that did create unsustainable systems that eventually collapsed catastrophically? The moral judgment in the myths might be later interpretation, but the core memory of advancement leading to catastrophe might be historical. The theme of forbidden knowledge appears repeatedly across traditions, always with the same implication that certain capabilities carry inherent dangers, that some understanding should perhaps remain unknown, that progress without wisdom invites disaster. Genesis presents the tree of knowledge, where gaining understanding comes with the price of exile from paradise. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humanity metallurgy, weaponry, and other arts that enable both creation and destruction. Greek mythology offers Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, bringing advancement but also suffering. The pattern suggests recognition that knowledge itself is neutral, but its application determines whether it builds or destroys. This isn't primitive superstition. This is sophisticated philosophical understanding that technological capability, without corresponding ethical development, creates existential risk. And the ancients apparently knew this, not through abstract reasoning but through experience, through witnessing or inheriting memory of what happens when power exceeds wisdom. The modern parallels make these ancient warnings feel uncomfortably prescient. Nuclear weapons represent knowledge that could destroy civilization in hours, capability that can't be uninvented, power that requires perfect wisdom and restraint forever to avoid catastrophic deployment. Genetic engineering raises fundamental questions about the limits of human modification of life, about what we should do versus what we can do. Artificial intelligence threatens to surpass human intelligence and potentially escape human control. Climate change results from technological capabilities deployed for short-term benefit without sufficient consideration of long-term consequences. We face the same pattern the myths describe: advancing knowledge, increasing power, questionable wisdom, potential catastrophe. The difference is that we have the myths as warnings, as preserved memory of what happens when this pattern plays out to its conclusion. Whether we'll heed those warnings remains uncertain. The myths also preserve the concept of cyclical time, of rise and fall as recurring pattern, rather than linear progression. Hindu yugas describe vast cycles of creation and destruction. Mayan world ages track successive creations and catastrophes. Greek tradition speaks of golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages, each one declining from the previous until reset becomes necessary. This isn't mystical revelation. This is empirical observation preserved across generations. Civilizations rise, achieve greatness, fall into corruption or make fatal mistakes, collapse catastrophically, and eventually rebuild to repeat the cycle. Each iteration learns from the previous one, or fails to learn and repeats the same mistakes. The flood myths function as the preserved lesson from the last cycle, the warning passed down to ensure descendants understand that what happened before can happen again. That advancement doesn't guarantee survival. That knowledge without wisdom leads to catastrophe. That pride precedes the fall not as moral judgment but as observable pattern. They warned us. Every culture, every tradition, every mythology that survived long enough to be recorded, they all preserved the same essential warning. They knew this because they'd seen it happen before, or inherited memory from those who witnessed it. The question is whether we're wise enough to recognize the warning, humble enough to acknowledge we might be repeating the pattern, and capable enough to make different choices before the cycle completes again. The myths suggest the answer isn't predetermined. We have agency, we have choice, but we also have the same human nature that led previous civilizations to destruction. And the water, the myths whisper, is always ready to rise again. The earth keeps records more reliable than any library. Layers of sediment, cores of ice, strata of rock. These preserve evidence that doesn't fade with time, doesn't get reinterpreted by successive generations, doesn't get burned when libraries fall or empires collapse. And when you examine these geological archives carefully, what you find supports the catastrophic accounts preserved in myth with remarkable precision. Meltwater Pulse 1A occurred approximately 14,000 years ago. This wasn't gradual sea level rise measured in millimeters per year. This was catastrophic release of glacial melt, raising global sea levels by 16 to 25 meters in less than 500 years. To put that in perspective, imagine standing on a coastline and watching the ocean advance inland by dozens of feet within a single human lifetime. Coastal settlements would have had years, perhaps decades, to relocate as their territories disappeared beneath advancing waters. River valleys would transform into estuaries, islands would vanish, entire geographical regions would be reshaped beyond recognition. Meltwater Pulse 1B came later, around 11,000 years ago, coinciding with the end of the Younger Dryas period. Another episode of rapid sea level rise, another period when humanity's relationship with coastlines would have been violently disrupted. And these weren't isolated events. Ice cores and sediment records show that sea level rise during deglaciation wasn't smooth or gradual, but episodic, marked by sudden jumps when ice dams failed and enormous glacial lakes released their contents catastrophically. The channeled scablands in Washington state preserve evidence of one such catastrophe. Massive channels carved through solid basalt by floods of unimaginable scale. Water moving with such force that it scoured away hundreds of feet of rock, leaving behind landscapes that look more like alien planets than terrestrial geography. These weren't normal river erosion working over millennia. These were catastrophic outburst floods when glacial Lake Missoula's ice dam failed, releasing more water than all the Great Lakes combined in a matter of days. The Black Sea flood hypothesis suggests the Mediterranean breached into the Black Sea basin around 7,500 years ago, transforming a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea within months or years. Coastal settlements around the former lake would have had no warning before the waters came. Some researchers see this event as the basis for regional flood myths, the catastrophe that survivors would remember and retell until memory became mythology. The Younger Dryas boundary layer appears in geological records worldwide, a distinct stratum containing evidence of sudden, violent environmental change. The platinum anomaly we discussed earlier, concentrations far above background levels suggesting extraterrestrial material distributed globally. Nanodiamonds that form only under extreme heat and pressure. Magnetic spherules consistent with impact events. A layer of carbon and soot indicating continental-scale wildfires burning simultaneously across vast distances. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve atmospheric history in annual layers going back over 100,000 years. What they reveal about the Younger Dryas period is startling. Temperature proxies show the cold snap beginning abruptly around 12,800 years ago, with temperatures in some regions dropping as much as 15 degrees Celsius within a single decade. Not gradual cooling, but sudden climate collapse. Then, around 11,600 years ago, equally sudden warming, the Younger Dryas ending as abruptly as it began. Isotopic signatures in these ice cores show unusual compositions during this period. Patterns some researchers interpret as evidence of solar bombardment or atmospheric disruption from impact events. The chemistry doesn't match normal climate variation. Something extraordinary was affecting Earth's atmosphere, something that left traces in the frozen record of ancient air. This is what makes the geological evidence so compelling. It's not dependent on interpretation of myths or archaeological context. It's physical, measurable, testable. The rocks remember sudden violence. The ice preserves atmospheric trauma. The sediments contain evidence of fires and floods and temperature swings that would have made survival nearly impossible across vast regions. And the timeframes align almost perfectly with the mythological accounts. The catastrophic flooding, described in legends worldwide, corresponds to periods of rapid sea level rise preserved in coastal sediments. The destruction by fire, mentioned in numerous traditions, coincides with evidence of massive wildfires in the geological record. The sudden climate change remembered in cultural narratives matches the temperature swings documented in ice cores. Either this is extraordinary coincidence, ancient peoples independently inventing myths that happen to correspond with actual geological events they had no way of knowing about, or the myths preserve genuine historical memory. The stories describe real catastrophes, because real catastrophes happened, events so traumatic that survivors passed down accounts through generations until they became the foundational narratives of cultures worldwide. The rocks remember what we forgot, and what they remember validates what the myths have been trying to tell us all along. Death leaves evidence. When species vanish, when populations crash, when ecosystems collapse, the physical record preserves what happened, even when memory doesn't. And the paleontological evidence from approximately 12,000 years ago tells a story of extinction on a scale that demands explanation beyond the gradual processes we typically associate with evolutionary change. The Quaternary extinction event eliminated over 100 genera of large mammals between 15,000 and 11,000 years ago. In North America alone, the losses were staggering. Woolly mammoths that had survived multiple previous climate fluctuations vanished. Mastodons disappeared. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant ground sloths, American lions, American camels, enormous beavers the size of bears, short-faced bears, larger than modern grizzlies, all gone within what appears geologically to be an instant. The pattern repeated globally. Australia lost its giant marsupials. South America saw the extinction of enormous ground sloths, giant armadillos, native horses and camels, predators and prey alike, vanishing in synchrony. Eurasia experienced similar losses. Species that had endured for millions of years, that had adapted to previous climate changes, that had coexisted with human hunters for thousands of years, suddenly reached simultaneous endpoints. The conventional explanation points to human overhunting, the overkill hypothesis suggesting that newly arrived human populations hunted megafauna to extinction. But this explanation faces significant problems. African megafauna coexisted with humans for hundreds of thousands of years without suffering similar extinctions. The hunting pressure required to drive these species to extinction, given sparse human populations and primitive hunting technology, seems unrealistically high. And the timing of extinctions coincides more closely with climate catastrophe than with human arrival in various regions. The alternative interpretation sees these extinctions as environmental rather than anthropogenic. Rapid climate change transforming ecosystems faster than large animals could adapt. Habitat loss as Ice Age conditions gave way to warmer, different landscapes. And potentially catastrophic events, impacts, fires, floods, creating cascades of environmental stress that pushed species already struggling with changing conditions past their survival thresholds. Extinction patterns support this environmental interpretation. Larger animals died out more readily than smaller ones, consistent with rapid change, favoring species with faster reproduction and greater adaptability. Island populations survived longer than mainland ones, suggesting continental catastrophes were more severe than isolated disasters. Certain regions showed more dramatic losses, possibly indicating impact zones or areas experiencing the most severe climate disruption. The evidence from preserved specimens is particularly striking. Mammoths found frozen in Siberian permafrost, with undigested vegetation still in their stomachs and mouths, as if death came so suddenly they didn't finish swallowing their last meal. The flowers and grasses preserved with them indicate they died during summer or early fall, not during winter when freezing might be expected. Something caught them completely by surprise, freezing them so rapidly that decomposition never began. Mass bone deposits appear at various sites worldwide, accumulations of remains suggesting catastrophic mortality events rather than gradual die-offs over extended periods. Some deposits show evidence of burning. Others show trauma consistent with violent death. The concentrations and conditions don't match patterns you'd expect from hunting or normal predation or disease. They suggest sudden, simultaneous death affecting entire populations. What survived reveals as much as what died. Smaller mammals made it through. Most bird species persisted. Marine life continued, though with some extinctions among coastal species. Certain large animals survived in isolated refugia, protected by geography from whatever was affecting their mainland relatives. The survival pattern suggests that size, location, and adaptability determined outcomes more than any single factor. Humans experienced their own bottleneck during this period. Genetic analysis indicates global human populations may have crashed to fewer than 10,000 individuals, creating a genetic choke point from which all modern humans descend. We survived, but barely. The diversity we see in modern human populations developed entirely after this bottleneck, meaning that whatever caused it was severe enough to bring our species to the edge of extinction alongside the megafauna we shared the world with. The mammoths died with flowers in their mouths. The ground sloths perished before reaching their burrows. The saber-toothed cats made no last stands. They simply ended, their remains preserved in layers of earth that mark the boundary between the world that was and the world that followed. Not gradual decline, but sudden catastrophe. Not evolutionary inevitability, but environmental trauma on a scale that transformed the planet's ecology within a geological instant. The bones remember. And what they remember isn't extinction through normal processes, but death through catastrophe that spared no species, no region, no ecosystem from its violence. Human artifacts tell stories stone and bone cannot. Tools change, settlements shift. Cultures rise and vanish, leaving traces that archaeologists piece together to reconstruct what happened when memory fails and myths become the only record. And around 12,000 years ago, the archaeological record shows disruptions that parallel the geological and paleontological evidence of catastrophe. The Clovis culture dominated North America approximately 13,500 years ago. These weren't primitive hunter-gatherers barely surviving. They were sophisticated people with advanced stone tool technology, the distinctive Clovis points found from Alaska to Central America, showing remarkable consistency in design and execution. They thrived across the continent, adapting to diverse environments, successfully hunting megafauna, establishing themselves as the dominant human presence in a vast territory. Then, around 12,800 years ago, they disappeared. Not gradually, not through visible conquest or assimilation. Sites showing continuous Clovis occupation simply stop. The technology vanishes from the archaeological record. What follows is a period of apparent disruption. Different and less sophisticated stone tool traditions, emerging as if populations had been scattered, knowledge lost, cultural continuity broken. The coincidence with the Younger Dryas impact event is exact. Whatever happened to the climate and the megafauna happened to the Clovis culture as well. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey presents a different mystery. This massive complex of carved stone monuments was deliberately buried around 10,000 years ago. The builders didn't abandon it to decay naturally. They carefully filled in the structures, covering them with earth, as if preserving them for future discovery or hiding them from something they feared. Why would people who invested enormous resources creating this site deliberately entomb their own work? Were they fleeing some threat? Protecting sacred knowledge from less advanced populations? Preserving evidence of their capabilities for descendants who might someday understand? The Natufian culture in the Levant shows evidence of early experimentation with agriculture and permanent settlement beginning around 13,000 years ago, then experiencing disruption during the Younger Dryas before agriculture fully developed in the subsequent Neolithic period. It's as if they were on the verge of a transition to farming when catastrophe interrupted the process, forcing a temporary return to more mobile, less complex subsistence strategies before stability allowed resumption of agricultural development. Settlement patterns worldwide show a notable feature. Most archaeological sites from before 10,000 years ago are inland or at higher elevations. Coastal sites from this period are extremely rare, not because ancient peoples avoided coasts, but because coastal settlements from the Ice Age now rest beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water. The absence isn't evidence that coastal civilizations didn't exist. It's evidence that sea level rise inundated them, leaving only highland sites accessible to archaeological investigation. This creates a fundamental bias in our understanding of pre-flood populations. We find what survived above the waterline. We don't find what drowned. If the most advanced pre-flood civilizations were coastal, as logic suggests, since coasts offer resources, trade routes, and moderate climates, then the archaeological record preferentially preserves evidence of less advanced inland populations, while the sophisticated coastal societies remain submerged and undiscovered. Agriculture's sudden appearance after the Younger Dryas presents another puzzle. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans hunted and gathered. Then, within just a few thousand years, farming emerged independently in the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes. Either this represents extraordinary coincidence, or it represents simultaneous rediscovery of techniques that were known before the catastrophe, lost during the climate chaos, and then independently recovered as conditions stabilized. The sophistication of early agriculture supports the rediscovery interpretation. The earliest farming communities show surprising understanding of selective breeding, irrigation management, and crop rotation knowledge that typically requires generations of experimentation to develop. It's as if they were working from existing understanding, rather than discovering everything through trial and error. Artifact distributions show another telling pattern. Advanced tools and artistic objects from before 12,000 years ago demonstrate sophistication comparable to much later periods. Then apparent simplification during the Younger Dryas, then gradual elaboration afterward. Not steady linear progress, but a pattern consistent with knowledge loss followed by slow recovery. They buried their temple and walked away. The Clovis culture vanished without clear explanation. Coastal settlements drowned beneath rising seas. Agriculture appeared suddenly after the catastrophe ended. The archaeological record doesn't show smooth cultural evolution. It shows disruption, loss, and recovery. It shows catastrophe preserved, not in myth, but in the material remains of peoples whose world ended and whose survivors had to rebuild from whatever fragments they could preserve through the chaos that destroyed everything they'd known.